In this episode, we're going to take the idea of segmentation and make it practical by talking about the gatekeepers that control movement between zones. Once you divide a network into areas with different trust levels, you need ways to decide what traffic is allowed to cross those boundaries and what traffic should be blocked, inspected, or redirected. That is where firewalls, proxies, and filtering strategies come in. These controls can sound intimidating because people often describe them with vendor names or feature lists, but the core ideas are simple. A firewall is a rule-enforcing boundary. A proxy is a controlled middleman that speaks on someone's behalf, and filtering is the general practice of allowing or denying traffic based on meaningful criteria. If you can keep those three concepts straight, you will be able to reason about most network security architecture decisions without getting lost. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.Author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Let's start with what a firewall actually is in plain terms. A firewall is a system that sits between two places and makes decisions about whether traffic is allowed to pass. Those two places might be the internet and an internal network, two internal security zones, or even two groups of systems inside a cloud environment. The firewall looks at information about the traffic, like where it came from, where it is going, and what kind of communication it claims to be, and then it applies a policy to decide. That policy usually includes rules that allow known, necessary traffic while blocking the rest. The beginner mindset to adopt is that a firewall is not magic protection. It is an enforcement point for decisions you already made about how the network should behave. If you do not know what should be allowed, a firewall cannot invent a safe architecture for you. It helps to understand that not all firewalls make decisions with the same depth. Early designs focused on simple packet filtering, meaning they looked at basic network details like source and destination IP addresses and port numbers. That can be effective, but it is also limited because attackers can sometimes use allowed ports for unwanted purposes. Over time, stateful inspection became common, meaning the firewall keeps track of the state of a conversation and can distinguish between a valid response to a request and an unexpected inbound connection attempt. This is useful because it aligns with how normal communication works and reduces the need to open broad inbound access. Modern designs often include what people call next-generation capabilities, but you do not have to memorize feature names to get the concept. The bigger point is that firewalls can operate at different levels of awareness, from basic addressing to deeper understanding of applications and behaviors. Placement is as important as capability, because where a firewall sits determines what it can protect. A perimeter firewall sits at the edge of a network and controls traffic between internal systems and the internet. An internal firewall sits between internal zones and limits lateral movement, which is often where real damage spreads during an intrusion. You can also have specialized boundary controls in front of certain applications, such as a web-facing tier, to reduce exposure. Beginners sometimes picture a firewall as a single box at the front door, but most mature designs use multiple enforcement points. This is not redundancy for its own sake. It is a way of enforcing different rules between different trust levels. A strong outer boundary does not help much if internal traffic is completely open, because many attacks rely on moving inside after an initial foothold. Now let's shift to proxies, because proxies solve a different kind of problem. A proxy is an intermediary that receives a request from a client and then makes the request to the destination on the client's behalf. That may sound like an unnecessary extra step, but it creates useful control and visibility. When traffic flows through a proxy, the proxy can enforce rules, log activity, and sometimes transform or sanitize content before it reaches the user. A forward proxy is typically used on the user side, controlling outbound access to the internet. A reverse proxy is used on the service side, sitting in front of servers and controlling how external users reach internal applications. The beginner takeaway is that a proxy becomes the official speaker for someone, which changes what the outside world can see and gives you a place to apply consistent policy. Proxies are especially helpful when you want to control web access in a way that is more meaningful than just allowing or blocking ports. If you simply allow outbound web traffic, you may be allowing a huge range of destinations and behaviors. A web proxy can apply policy based on the website being accessed, the category of content, the identity of the user, or whether the traffic matches known risky patterns. It can also help prevent direct connections from internal devices to unknown external servers by forcing all web traffic through a controlled route. That controlled route improves logging, which is critical when you later need to understand what happened. Proxies can also support content scanning, which is a way of looking for malware or suspicious content in files being downloaded. You do not need to know the mechanics of scanning, but you should appreciate why a middleman position is valuable when you care about what is actually happening at the application level. Filtering strategies are the broader set of choices you make about what to allow, what to block, and what to watch. Filtering can be applied to network traffic, web requests, DNS queries, email flows, and many other channels. The simplest model is deny by default and allow only what is needed, because that approach reduces unexpected pathways. In practice, beginners often see allow lists and deny lists used together, where certain destinations or services are explicitly allowed and certain known bad ones are blocked. The problem is that deny lists tend to grow endlessly because attackers change infrastructure quickly, while allow lists can be too restrictive if you do not understand the business needs. A more stable strategy focuses on building rules around known use cases, known user groups, and known system roles. When policy follows business reality, it becomes easier to keep it accurate and enforceable. A key architecture decision is whether your filtering should be mostly inbound focused, outbound focused, or balanced. Many people instinctively focus on blocking inbound attacks from the internet, which is important, but modern threats also involve outbound communication. If a compromised system can freely connect outbound to any destination, it may be able to receive instructions, send stolen data, or download additional tools. That is why egress filtering matters, which is simply controlling outbound traffic. For beginners, the term egress can be thought of as leaving the network, and the security goal is to make outbound traffic predictable and limited. A well-designed environment often has strict rules about what internal systems are allowed to initiate connections to the internet and on what ports. When outbound behavior is constrained, unusual traffic becomes easier to detect. Another useful lens is to think about who initiates a connection and who should be allowed to respond. Many architectures aim to reduce unsolicited inbound connections into sensitive zones. Instead of letting random sources connect directly to internal systems, you might allow only specific entry points, such as a reverse proxy or a tightly controlled service interface. This concentrates exposure into fewer, better protected places. It also makes monitoring more effective because you have fewer paths to watch. Firewalls help with this by tracking state and allowing return traffic for legitimate sessions while blocking unexpected attempts. Proxies help by serving as the front door for applications or the controlled exit door for users. Filtering ties it all together by enforcing what kinds of conversations are allowed to begin in the first place. It is also important to understand how these controls relate to identity, because traffic is not just packets. It represents people and systems doing things. A firewall rule that allows a whole network segment to reach a sensitive system may be too broad if only a small subset of devices should have access. A proxy can sometimes enforce policy based on user identity, which allows more precise control than network location alone. Even when identity is not part of the decision, designing rules around system roles is a step toward least privilege. For example, a database server might only accept connections from an application server zone, not from user workstations. That is a role-based communication pattern, and it is a strong architectural habit. When you combine segmentation with role-based filtering, you reduce the number of relationships an attacker can exploit. Beginners often ask whether a firewall and a proxy are competing tools, but it is more accurate to see them as complementary layers. A firewall is a boundary enforcer that is excellent at controlling network-level flows and limiting broad exposure. A proxy is a controlled intermediary that is excellent at enforcing application-aware policy and improving visibility into user or service behavior. Filtering strategies describe the decisions you implement across these tools, such as blocking risky destinations, restricting outbound access, or enforcing that sensitive services are reachable only through approved entry points. A mature design often uses both firewalls and proxies because they solve different pieces of the overall problem. If you only use one type of control, you may end up stretching it beyond what it does best. The architectural goal is not to buy a single perfect product, but to place appropriate controls at the right boundaries. There are also important trade-offs to consider, so you do not design something that looks secure on paper but fails in practice. Deep inspection and content filtering can increase security, but they can also add latency, create operational complexity, and sometimes break applications that expect direct connections. Overly broad rules make life easy for users, but create huge risk surfaces, while overly narrow rules can cause constant outages and workarounds. Logging everything sounds good until you realize that too much noise hides meaningful signals. Good architecture finds a balance by focusing on high-value boundaries and high-risk traffic, rather than trying to inspect every possible path equally. One practical mindset is to focus on protecting critical assets and controlling the most common attack pathways, such as web traffic, remote access, and administrative access. You want rules that are enforceable, understandable, and maintainable, because security that cannot be operated reliably is not security. A common misconception is that the presence of a firewall means the environment is secure. A firewall with poorly thought-out rules can be little more than decoration, and a firewall with overly permissive defaults can allow exactly the traffic you hope to prevent. Another misconception is that blocking a few known bad destinations is sufficient when attackers can create new destinations quickly. This is why policy should emphasize what is allowed rather than chasing everything that might be bad. It is also why segmentation matters, because even if something slips through, internal boundaries can limit movement. When you hear someone say an organization was breached despite having a firewall, the lesson is not that firewalls are useless. The lesson is that controls must be designed as a system, with clear intent and layered boundaries. As you think about choosing strategies, practice describing them as simple statements of intent. You might say that user devices can browse the internet only through a proxy that applies category controls and logs activity. You might say that public-facing applications are accessed through a reverse proxy, while internal systems are not directly reachable from outside. You might say that internal zones can talk only along known application paths, and everything else is blocked and logged at the boundary. Notice how these statements are about relationships and trust, not about specific products. Architecture decisions should read like policies written in plain language. Once you can say the policy clearly, the choice of firewall placement, proxy roles, and filtering methods becomes much more straightforward. The technology exists to enforce the policy, but the clarity of the policy is what makes the enforcement meaningful. In conclusion, choosing firewalls, proxies, and filtering strategies is really about choosing how traffic is allowed to move between trust zones and what you want to learn from that movement. Firewalls provide boundary enforcement for network flows and help reduce exposure between segments and to the outside world. Proxies act as controlled intermediaries that can enforce more context-aware policy and create stronger visibility into web and application access. Filtering strategies tie these controls together by defining what is allowed, what is blocked, and what is monitored, with special attention to outbound behavior and role-based communication. When these choices align with segmentation and business needs, they reduce risk and make incidents easier to contain and investigate. The guiding rule to keep in your head is that every allowed pathway should have a clear reason to exist, and every boundary should make it harder for unwanted traffic to reach what matters most.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.